You all know Bob Goodman. Bob Goodman is a great speaker. Bob Goodman is an expert in the field of economics. He is a well-known economic analyst and consultant. He was a former consultant for Putnam Investments, which is a very well-known investment firm. While with Putnam, Bob was a member of the company's business advisory group, which was a panel of experts on economic, business, and personal financial topics. Bob has been a consultant and spokesperson before broker, financial service industry, and business groups. He has been quoted in the media consistently and has appeared frequently on the cable news network as well as on CNBC. He's also done several radio appearances on the topic of economics. He's very well known in terms of the economy, and we're so very grateful to have him back. Please welcome Dr. Robert Goodman.
Thank you. I'm going to use this because I really don't like hiding behind the podium. I want to thank you all for having me back. I was thinking about this. I think the first time I addressed this group was in 2008. And every year since, so we've been through a couple of cycles together. So thank you. Number two, let me tell you the job of an economist in a financial firm. You go into the investment committee typically at the end of the year, and you try and tell investment specialists what kind of an environment they're going to confront in the coming years. And to do that, what you're required to do, and by the way, this is happening right now all over the world, not just in the United States, these groups meet, and the economist begins to tell them not only where they have been, but where they are, and then, based on assumptions that they're forced to make, gives them some idea of what those assumptions imply for the economic environment in which they're going to be making very important investment decisions. Tonight, briefly, I want to treat this group as an investment committee and bring you up to date on where we have been, where we are, and then hopefully give you some notion as what you're going to confront, at least in the next year ahead, and maybe longer. Now, since we've been speaking, we've seen this economy literally collapse. 2008 was no joke. It was a financial collapse unlike anything we had seen since the Great Depression. Most people operating in that environment had never operated in the Great Depression. They were learning as they went, and that, by the way, included the Federal Reserve Board. To get out of that mess, what we did at that point was flood the system with reserves, with money, forcing interest rates down. And when the Fed could no longer lower short rates, they had a QE1, QE2, QE3, where they purchased government bonds, mortgage-backed bonds. They flooded the system with money. What we found out then, in hindsight, is that this country ran into what they call in the textbooks a liquidity trap. The government was not able to lower interest rates enough, even at zero, to get those funds into the real sector of the American economy. The link between the financial sector and the real sector was severed. Very much like what happened during the Great Depression. What was happening was that all these funds were finding their way into financial assets. The low interest rates, all those funds were giving investors an incentive to take on more and more risk. To get yield, you no longer stayed in a money market fund. You wanted yield, you went to 5-year bonds, then 10-year, then 20, then 30-year bonds. And when that wasn't enough, they went from AAA to AA to single A to triple B. And what happened, fortunately, was it was enough to get the economy to begin very slowly to recover. I think you may all remember, year after year after year, as we plodded along, as this economy barely got its head above water, what we had been saying, what I was suggesting to you was, it was like a rocket ship being put into orbit with two engines, two fuel tanks, a monetary fuel tank and a fiscal fuel tank, and all we were using was the monetary tank. We got it into orbit. We avoided a collapse. The rocket was going around, but eventually gravity would slow it down, the economy would slow down, and the rocket, the economy, would again collapse towards Earth. What was required then was to use the fiscal tank of fuel. We needed a fiscal stimulus. What kept the government in the United States from doing what was absolutely necessary, what was done in the 30s, what every textbook, irrespective of political bias, said to do, was to have a fiscal stimulus program big enough to directly get into the economy and spend money, to give consumers the ability to spend, to give businesses the ability to spend and invest in new equipment, in plant, to get that engine revving, to send that rocket into a higher orbit and keep it up there. And year after year after year, we refused to do it. The excuse was the deficit is too big. We cannot afford the kind of stimulus that would be required. $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion in a $20 trillion economy, and our government refused to do it. And the economy was at risk back in 10 and 11 and 12 and 14 of slowing down and then going down the hole. By 2016, we did no longer have a choice. The government had to find some excuse to convince the American people what they had been telling us all along wasn't true. That deficits really don't matter to the United States. And they don't. We'll talk about that in a second. And in 2017, we got a massive tax cut and a huge spending increase. And the result was predictable. Consumers with more money to spend, spent it. And the economy, led by the consumer, as the textbooks would have suggested, started to accelerate. From 2% to 3%, and then 3% again. You could see it happening. Things were working. Now, we got some optimistic and very rosy forecasts, so we're going to grow at 5 and 6%. I know that. But we were on a different growth path because of that fiscal stimulus. Again, something an Econ 101 student would have predicted if they had known in advance that we were going to get that kind of massive stimulus. And then we made a colossal, historic mistake. And again, not rocket science to figure this one out. Every textbook, every class in basic economics tells you, if you have a trade dispute, you do not solve that dispute by levying tariffs on your trading partners. It does not work because they will retaliate. They have constituents also. They cannot look weak. In many cases, they're not democracies. They make a decision. They don't have to go to the people. And they will retaliate. And then you will re-retaliate. They will re-retaliate. And world trade ultimately will collapse. For many countries in this world, trade, exports and imports, is a huge proportion of their total economy. It can throw them into recession. Now you can argue, well, we're better off than they are, we can withstand it. No, we cannot. Do you know what happened? It caused tremendous uncertainty in the business community. The way you deal with those kinds of trade issues is to go to the World Trade Organization that's set up to deal with these disputes. Whether you like it or not is not the point. If you have a strong enough case to say that China is cheating, that they're stealing our technology, they're lowering their currencies, whatever it is that you're upset about, you make your case to the World Trade Organization. Do you know that in 71% of the cases that we brought to the World Trade Organization, we won? Then you get the world behind you, and the other country that you're talking about conforms. It's legitimized. What we did, if you want an analogy when you're talking to your friends, what we did was insane. It's like two people who love antiques. They love antiques. They're crazy about antiques. But they hate each other. They really hate each other. And one day they each separately walk into an antique store. And while they're admiring all these beautiful antiques, they see each other and they hate each other. They reach down and grab what's ever convenient, a bat or a club, and they start swinging wildly at each other, missing. But what are they doing in the meantime? They are destroying the very antiques that they adore. That's what we have done. And it caused tremendous uncertainty. How do you make an investment decision to build a plant that won't come online for 3 years if you don't know whether the demand for your product will be there? You know what happens? You don't make that decision. You see, in the business cycle, if you remember your Econ 101, and I saw one young fellow who probably took it not too long ago, will remember this. There's something called the multiplier effect in an economy. That comes when you get a tax cut, a spending increase, and consumers begin to respond. It happens first. And that's exactly what happened, didn't it? The consumer spending picked up, and to this day, consumer spending is still strong. But after a while, that tax cut begins to lose some effect. But what takes over then is called the accelerator effect. People forget about this. It's businesses beginning to spend on plant and equipment to satisfy that consumer demand in the future, and that gives the economy another boost, hires people, they earn salaries, they have income, they buy, and the cycle is prolonged. And what we did is stepped on that second level. We killed the accelerator effect. Manufacturing spending in the United States in the last couple of quarters is down. We gave businesses a tremendous tax cut, and people say, see, it didn't work. Sure, it didn't work. You know what they're doing with that money? Because they're not going to spend it on plant and equipment when they're so uncertain. They increase their dividends. They buy a competitor. They buy back their own stock. That's what they do with it. Now that may have secondary and tertiary effects, but nowhere near what would happen if we spent it on productivity, enhancing equipment, or plant. And so what we did inadvertently is step on this recovery. And quite frankly, it's put everything in doubt now. It was easy a year or two ago to make a forecast. We get that fiscal stimulus and here's what's going to happen. No one predicted a trade war. We did it in 1930. And with the best of intentions, I want to tell you, it's always done with the best of intentions. To help American labor compete with low-cost foreign workers, we levied a 50% tariff across the board on everything. And our partners retaliated, and we sent the world from recession to a depression. Now, I'm far from predicting a depression. Please don't come away with that idea. But the problem is, I don't know, and you don't know, and the economists on Wall Street don't know what is going to result from this dispute. First we hear there's going to be a settlement in phase one, then it's off, then it's on. This does no good, and here's the risk. If in the meantime something happens that frightens consumers, Now, that could be anything from impeachment to conviction. It could be Europe going into recession. It will not matter where the mortgage rates go from 4% to 2%. No one is going to take out a mortgage if they're worried about having a job in 1 or 2 years. They're just not going to do it. Low interest rates will not work. The Fed is out of bullets right now. 1.5 percentage points left and we're back at zero. Europe is negative interest rates. Can you imagine getting paid to borrow money? And Germany just missed a recession this quarter, but Europe could go into recession any month now. And that's pretty scary. If something were to happen, I want you to ask yourselves, if this economy dips into recession, what would our government do now to avoid it? Well, interest rates are zero. Not much you can do. You can pour the money out, but it is not getting into the real economy. It will not go to plant and equipment. It will not do a darn thing. So when you want to rely on fiscal policy again, given the politics, given the rhetoric, given the people on CNBC and CNN and all the rest talking about $1 trillion deficit this year, it is highly unlikely that our government is going to see fit to give us a $2 trillion tax cut and spending increase again. So just ask yourselves, what do we do? No fiscal stimulus, no monetary stimulus because you're in that liquidity trap, and the United States does not have the luxury of lowering its currency. It cannot devalue, and even if they could, everybody else would devalue with us. There would be no mechanism this time around, should we slip into recession, to get us out of it. Now, in mathematical terms, in economics textbooks and on blackboards, not to worry, because the economy will equilibrate itself. You know how? You begin to spiral down in a deflationary situation, much like the Depression, where all of a sudden, after a while, your real balances, your money, buys you more. You feel that you're better off, not because you have more dollars, because they go further, and you begin to spend again. Unfortunately, that might happen at an unemployment rate in this country of 12 to 15%. Can you imagine, given our environment today, this isn't the 30s, what might happen with a 12% unemployment rate? So we're at real risk, and you want to know why people are concerned, is because those that will speak honestly, and in the investment committees, they speak honestly. I don't know what they do when they get on CNBC representing some of the bigger firms. You never want to be negative if you're the economist from Merrill Lynch. You get fired real quick. Because the brokers call up and say, hey, what's that guy doing? I heard him on CNBC talking about a bad market. I can't sell stocks in a bad market, and they get rid of it. Happened twice in my career, I saw that. Very, very few economists will tell you this. It sounds hopeless. It isn't. For all I know, next month, we have a trade agreement. We say we're rescinding all those tariffs, and China says we're taking down all the tariffs, and Europe takes a deep breath. And that makes people feel better and more certain about the future. They begin to spend some. Businesses then begin to spend, and that cycle gets prolonged. What we cannot afford, and we have to watch very carefully, and it cannot be predicted, is the data. If the numbers start to suggest this economy is coming apart, then it is reasonable and rational to take a very negative view of the economic environment in which you are all going to have to make investment decisions, and I couldn't begin to help you with your business. You know what you do better than any economist. You deal with it, and you know how you deal with it. If it's done correctly, if all of a sudden people take a deep breath, step back, and say, no, we're not going to go that route, we're going to rescind these tariffs, and this cycle could run a long, long time, and the markets, which reflect the health of the U.S. economy here, good or bad, were reflected by going to levels even the optimists today don't dream of. But folks, the risk, if we do not do that, is just short of disastrous for your wealth. And so, what you want to take away from a discussion like this is, everybody in this room has a different set of parameters. Different wealth, different needs. What you want to do is allocate your assets in a way that reflects the risk that you need. Now, I'm an old fellow, and I know guys my age that think like they're 30. And they have kids that are 30, think like they're 80. You have to say to yourself, look, I cannot afford to take the same risk I did when I was 30 or 40 or even 50. I have to take an appropriate risk, and if you need 3% on your assets to live comfortably and make your lifestyle unchanged, take a 3% risk. No more and no less. Take a 2% risk, you're going to feel it. You take an 8% risk and things go bad, I will tell you, it will kill you, literally and figuratively. So what you want to do really is sit down quietly and go over your assets and say, am I too heavily invested in this? Not that you're not taking risk, but is it an appropriate risk? An economist can't tell you what stocks to buy or what bonds to buy, but you know, given your wealth, given your income situation, what you really need to do. And allocate it appropriately, and as the data comes in, adjust it periodically to be appropriate. The Fed knows a lot about this. The Fed is saying they're data-driven. All that means is they're waiting to see the data too. And they're saying basically, hey, the economy needs lower interest rates, we're there to give it to you. And if the economy needs higher interest rates, we're there to give it to you. That doesn't give you much information at all. But it's very good news. The economy is not operating on a forecast because their forecasts can and have been wrong. If they think the economy is going to be strong and they raise rates too soon, they'll kill you. Or too soft and they lower rates too much, they'll kill you another way. So they're just waiting for the data to come through. That's what you need to do. And adjust your business plans appropriately. But this is probably the most dangerous environment we've seen since 2007, and before that you've got to go back literally to 1930. At the very least, as we go into the end of this year and into next, with all the political things that will happen, a lot of economic numbers are going to be coming out, some good, some bad. The volatility will make you sick. It will jump all over the place. You want to know a good analogy for this market? It's like a bucking bronco. You go to the rodeo. Take a look at those. Those guys get on that bull. They cinch their fist under the rope. They let it go, and out they come. And that bronco is trying to throw you off its back. It twists, it turns, it jumps, it dips. What you're supposed to do is not jump off the horse. The people that make it, that stay on, that hold on tight to a plan that makes sense, you last 8 or 10 seconds with that horse and all of a sudden it stops jumping. It gives you the greatest ride, it remembers you. If you jump off, it'll probably kick you in the head. Too many people get thrown by the volatility. And we're destined to go through it, folks. There is absolutely nothing we can do about it. Nobody can tell you what to do, but if you are allocated appropriately in your own mind, you take an appropriate amount of risk, you will feel better about what is going on because you understand that it will hurt you least of all. So, the forecast, if there's a forecast here, is that the data will show you the economy growing but perhaps a little slower than we are right now. We're growing at around 2%, with only 1.7% inflation. After an 11-year economic expansion, unless there's something wrong with the numbers, and some skeptics say they are, I don't know. That tells us that what's at real risk here is the recession and a deflation. You know, one of the few financial assets that does well in a collapse in prices in the United States? Treasuries. Because interest rates come down very sharply on a very high quality piece of paper that everybody in the world wants, because you watch what happens. We get into trouble, you know who buys our treasuries? Our enemies. China loads up on them. Russia loads up on them. It's the safest thing in the world. And interest rates come down and treasury prices, believe it or not, go up in the face of collapsing stocks and everything else. So, again, the warning is be appropriately allocated and start now. Don't wait for the volatility, start now when things are okay. And you'll feel a lot better when this ride becomes bumpy. So let me just say, that's pretty quick. I will answer any questions you have, and if you gotta leave, I understand that, and I can hand you this microphone, and I'll get to the podium.
Thank you. I read today that the deficit has increased substantially very recently. What is the impact of that, in your opinion?
Okay, you heard the question. The deficit has increased substantially. It certainly has. It's going to be this year $1 trillion. It's estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to be at least $1 trillion for the next 10 years. What is most important is not the dollar level of the deficit. It's the burden of the debt. If you tell me, you know, Bob, I owe $1 million. What does that tell me about your financial condition? Nothing. I have to know your income, your wealth. It's the burden of that debt that's important. So what's key here is not the dollar size. In 1982, the deficit was $100 billion and people thought it was the end of the world. It's the relationship between the total debt and the size of the economy. And if over the next 10 years we can grow in dollar terms, inflation plus real growth, faster than the debt accumulates, which is about 5% right now, that ratio, that debt burden would actually go down. It is not the size of the debt. If you spend your time worrying about things you shouldn't worry about, you'll get yourself in real trouble. There are enough things to worry about that are dangerous without spinning your wheels on something that to the United States means nothing. I don't care about 50 years from now. I'm not a politician. I'm trying to make an investment now, and the debt doesn't matter to us. It matters to Brazil because they can't print the money. I will tell you, you go to a restaurant, have a great meal. If you can tear off a piece of that napkin and write your name on that piece of napkin and give it to the waiter and they accept it for payment of the meal, hey, he'll only do that if he can tear off a piece of that and give it to another waiter. Give it to go out and buy it. If people accept that piece of paper with your name on it, you can do that in perpetuity. But you can't. We can. We can. And sometimes we should. There are times we shouldn't, but right now we should. The likelihood is now we won't. Yes, sir.
I have a comment and a question. I remember the last time you spoke here, I don't know if it was last year or the year before, and I was struck by your comment about saying, don't worry about the debt. And then I thought, oh, I left you feeling good. And then it seemed, just coincidentally, I heard economist after economist, whether it was on radio or TV, saying, you know, our debt is out of control. So I'm curious to hear you come back and say that, again, not to worry about the debt that the country has. And then my second question, actually, is when you talk about allocations, you said you can't really tell individuals what their allocation should be, but can you give us sort of a broad, like a certain percentage should be in treasury, a certain percentage should be in commodities, etc.?
Okay, let me take the second part of that first. How do you judge what's appropriate? The rule of thumb used by financial planners is you take your age, subtract it from 100. That number is the amount of stock, of equity you should own on average. So if you're 50, they'll tell you 50% stocks is a fair allocation. If you're 70, 30%. If you're 80, 20. You just can't afford to take the risk. So there are rules of thumb. That's why most people have financial planners that help them out. As far as the allocation is concerned, I will tell you right now that some part of your portfolio should be in these fairly low-yielding treasuries. Won't be enough to make up the loss, God forbid things collapse, but they will go up in price when things fall apart. The rest of it is individual allocation. As far as the debt is concerned, folks, in 1981, I was told that the debt was $100 billion and we're going to collapse. There were books written about the collapse of the 80s. We were going in, to a hole that we never get out of because of the debt. Had you focused on the debt then, you never would have made the investments that boomed in the 80s. You never would have seen the stock market go from 1,000 below, actually 777 to 3,000 by 1990. You never would have seen that because you were thinking about the wrong things. We had debt all through this last 15 years. We just piled it on. The equity markets are looking through that. But there are real issues that investors will focus on. I hope I alerted you to what they may be, but it is not the debt. Will they talk about it consistently? Absolutely. They will write books about the debt. They will compare us to Brazil, that we're bankrupt. No. I can only say no. Will the market fall apart? It might, but it will not be because of the burden of the debt. We will sell our debt no matter what. The world will purchase it at 1% interest rates because it's the best asset in the world because they know we can print the money at least to give it back to them, where Brazil, China, Russia, they cannot. It's just a fact of life. So I'll reiterate it again. Yes, sir.
Hang on, Jeff. I'll walk the mic over to you. Give me a few seconds. Okay, here we go.
Over the past few months, have been to talk about the inverse of the yield curve, short-term versus long-term, and the prediction of possible recession, the doom and gloom. Can you comment on
Sure.
that a little bit?
As many of you know, the yield curve, which is the structure of interest rates from the shortest to the longest rates, traditionally, typically, is sloped upward. You're taking more risks to go out further, you have to get paid for it. And so interest rates typically go up, and a positively sloped curve just means that the longer the maturity, the higher the yield, and it slopes upward. Occasionally, that yield curve will invert, where long rates are lower than short rates. Now, you can correlate that with recessions. And the record is fairly good. 7 out of 10 times the yield curve inverts for a while, not just for a day or two, but it stays that way. And, we've had a recession 18 months down the road. As you know, a few months back, the yield curve inverted, and everybody was, oh, here it comes. It stayed inverted. Now it's come back somewhat. Those kinds of measures are interesting, but just one measure doesn't tell you enough. What you want to focus on, you want to think about it, are the policies pursued by the government. And the question you have to ask is not what is the yield curve doing, but are those policies appropriate to keep this economy growing over time? If for whatever reason you don't think so, if you feel they'll never do this trade deal, it's going to collapse, we're going to levy more tariffs and they're going to pile on, hey, I don't care where your yield curve is at that point, we're going to have a problem. So while the yield curve is interesting, it is not the thing you really ought to be watching. Yes, sir.
Follow up to the point that politics and economics go hand in hand, if you will. I'd like to know why New York State recently passed a series of rent regulations that hurt the landlords across the state if they're looking to have growth.
Yes.
They're looking to have growth in a very solid economic situation, that is real property. Why did they pass these stupid, idiotic laws that hurt those of us who can invest money in the real estate industry? So they're not following your advice, because they wouldn't have passed these. They said, we want the engine to keep going. Instead, they've passed laws to restrict us, to make us less money than we were making. Do you have any comment on that?
Oh,
Because I
boy.
think many of us in here are they would like to know what the hell New York State, which is becoming more communistic and socialistic by the minute.
Let me tell you, in 1996, I wrote a book. In 1996, I wrote a book. And in the book, I had a chapter on the growing inequality in the United States. And I made this point that you got to keep in mind. Economic fairness, economic justice is not necessarily social fairness and social justice. Our economic system, the market system you're talking about, looks at economic fairness. It looks at your contribution to the system. It rewards you based on your contribution. There is no guaranteed end game. There just isn't. So what our government tends to do is focus on social fairness, and in doing so, again with the best of intentions, you can't argue about the growing gap in inequality. You let our economy grow, and you're going to get that, because we're not all equally productive. But we all vote, and we all count once. Democracy and capitalism are not compatible systems. Period. Do not expect it. So what our politicians are giving into is the will of the people who don't understand that by hurting you to get some short-term benefits, they hurt themselves in the long run. Your employers. Do you want to work for a company that's not making money? That's insane. So please, don't confuse these things. You cannot burden our market system with morality. You can't do it. I know it's nice, I know it feels good, but it cannot happen. You know, I'll tell you why, and this is the perfect group to talk to. Do you guys remember a TV show years ago, Dynasty? Yes. Beautiful woman, handsome guy, they own boats and planes and islands. And in one segment, I remember watching this, Blake and his wife, they're flying off to one of their islands. And they have a few drinks, and she says to him, she says, dear, if tomorrow we lost the planes and the boats and the islands, would you still love me as much as you do? And he looked at her and he says, of course I would, sweetheart. But I will tell you this, in 1 year, I would have it all back. You can give the illusion of helping people by giving them something. You can give somebody $15 an hour. Will that make them better off? Sure. For about a couple of years, until either they lose their job and have no income, or inflation picks up because they're not putting anything in the system to justify it, and prices bid up $15, so the next time around they need $20. In 1971, I testified in front of Congress, and let me tell you, you want something intimidating, try that sometime. These guys had no clue how the system worked. They were talking then about a $4 minimum wage. And I remember that it was my turn, and I said, you know, $4 won't give people a living wage. Why don't we make it $10 an hour? And one of the Congress people said, Dr. Goodman, we can't afford $10 an hour. And I said, with all due respect, you cannot afford $4 an hour. You cannot give people in the long run more than they put into the system. The system takes it back from them. It's a cruel hoax. So to answer your question, you can expect more of that social engineering, not less. It will make you have to make inefficient decisions in our environment. It will hurt you. Nobody cares about a guy who's got 50 billion bucks paying another 2% until they figure out a guy with 50 billion bucks doesn't have to live here. They find all kinds of ways to revalue their art. So something that cost 3 million bucks all of a sudden next year is worth $50. There's all kinds of ways around it, but you're going to get more of it, not less of it, and the reason is the people in a democracy get what they want, and you are now in the minority. And that's a very tough thing to do, to understand, but you've got to, it's realistic, and you got a plan for it. I don't like it, but it's the way things are. Yes, sir.
Follow up to that question. What then is your advice regarding investing in real estate at this time? Follow up to that, gentlemen. Follow up to that question. What then is your advice regarding making investments in real estate at this time?
Well, again, you guys know your business better than I, but I'll tell you this, there's all kinds of real estate, different type, commercial, and if things get bad, it's going to be a very tough market for your business. What you're supposed to do in my business and in your business is buy low and sell high. Too often, what we do, hey, listen, we buy high and we sell low because we watch CNBC and they tell us to do that and we panic. If you've got cash and you see properties that make sense to you with your professional judgment and they're going down in price and somebody's got a distressed sale that might not look good this year or next year, but in 3 or 4 years could be gangbusters, that makes sense. But don't get scared out of doing something just because prices are going down. If you own something that is going to be worthwhile in the longer run, then you want to accumulate it, and what you do is what you're supposed to do in the financial area. Exploit the problems of others. Exploit the mistakes of others. Isn't that nuts? Does that sound good? That's our business. Think of it. You buy a stock tomorrow and I guarantee you, and I don't use that word lightly, I guarantee you the guy that sells it to you at 50 bucks a share is saying to herself, I don't believe the guy bought that stock at 50. And I know what you're going to be saying when you buy that stock. I don't believe she sold it to me at 50. It's all exploitation. So the way to find out whether you're making the right business decision or investment decision, after you do it, not before, but after you do it, go to your best buddy and say to him or her, tell him what you did. You know, I just did this, I just did it. And then say, are you crazy? Don't you know about this or that? You'll know you did the right thing. And if they say, yeah, me too, then you got to rethink what you did. You're always going to be in the minority if you make the right decision. It's that in my business, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to be alone with a decision like that. It's much more fun to be in a group. Did you do that? Yeah, me too. Oh my God, you know. Sure. It's backwards. It's counterintuitive. It takes a lot of guts that I don't personally have. Otherwise, I would be doing what my friend Ed Lashings does. I mean, really. I thought Ed was nuts, and now I know he's not so crazy. You know? So that's the problem with all this. That in the end, it's up to you and your spouse, your significant other. You sit down and say, hey, what do we need? And then make sure that your portfolio reflects that, and no more, and certainly no less. A planner can help you, but in the end, you're on your own, and the media will hurt you because there's an opinion out there for everybody. On TV, did you ever hear anybody say, I don't know? I did that once. On CNBC, 6 in the morning. I just got up. The anchor woman said, Dr. Bob, the Fed had a meeting that day. Dr. Bob, what's the Fed going to do at 2:15 this afternoon? I didn't have a clue. I really didn't. So I was honest. I said, you know, I really don't know. 10 seconds of dead air. It's like a lifetime. I mean, she looked at me, I looked at her, there's nothing. The producer, you ever see they wear the little things in their ear? The producer yelled so loudly in her ear, I heard it from 3 feet away. Asking something he does know. They don't care what you say, as long as you say something, but it affects people. It scares people. They will tell you the deficit is $1 trillion. These are the same people who said it was $100 billion. So there's a lot of information out there, some of it good, some of it bad, but unfortunately you're on your own. Yes, and I'll just take one more and then you guys, I know you want to do it. Yes, sir?
You talked a lot about the trade war affecting U.S. manufacturing companies. There's a theory or a notion out there that what we're really doing is punishing our competitors that took advantage of us for so many years. Why isn't it that the manufacturing companies are not benefiting from this?
Because our manufacturing companies in many cases manufacture abroad. Their products are facing tariffs from us. You know, they're retaliating. They don't retaliate on our egg producers. They retaliate on our wheat producers. I mean, and so now we're giving subsidies to those people that are getting hurt. It makes no sense. It's just the wrong thing to do. And what's worse, it's hurting the expectations of these folks. They're not making those investments. They're not buying the tractors. That affects John Deere. That affects the workers who work for John Deere. And it just spirals down the line. You can see, you know, the wheels within the wheels. And that's what makes this so absolutely dangerous. Now, I want to end just by saying, you've been very kind. I know this group. You get up and you run. I know it, because you're busy. I want to thank you very much. If I'm lucky enough to be invited back next year, I really hope for all of us, we get through this nightmare in a way that benefits everyone in this room. Good luck. Thank you very much.